The US presidential election is coming. What's going to happen? Will Donald Trump defy the polls as he did in 2016 to stun the world once again, or will he become the latest one-term president? Let's have a look. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for change makers. The thing we learned in 2016 was that few of us really know how the rules work anymore. I mean, we thought we did, but Donald Trump broke just about every one of those rules, and I mean smashed them into the ground, jumped all over them with big, thick, heavy boots, and then went on to win the race anyway. So, to assess his chances this time, we need to understand why he was able to win the first time, why until recently it seemed highly probable he was going to win again, why he's now in trouble, as even he seems to acknowledge, and whether and how he could still pull it out of the fire. By the way, if you're not familiar with this channel, you might need to get used to the style here, which is non-partisan, determinedly non-ideological. The aim is to look at the evidence the way that it is, not the way that you or the other people might like it to be. This is a highly polarised subject. This video neither argues for nor against Trump. It just looks at what's going on. And if you have a deep moral objection to that, you might as well stop watching now. All right. The first thing to note is that when Trump was first elected, I was one of those who was not entirely surprised. Why? Because I'd been following the blog of Scott Adams, the Dilbert cartoonist, who explained why, in his mind, Trump was a master persuader. He argued that many of Trump's apparent gaffes were all playing a part in manipulating the discussion in the way that most benefited Trump. A number of the things he said rang true, although I've come to a different conclusion about Trump's skill set overall in the light of what's happened since. So let's go through why he won, starting with the aspects that Scott Adams highlighted and then going on to a few others. First, Trump had, and let's face it, still has, the ability to draw all the attention and suck the oxygen out of the room for all the other candidates, which was particularly effective in the 2016 primaries. A bunch of normal political candidates, not one of them could draw attention away from Trump's latest outrageous statements. His gaffes got headlines which everyone assumed would damage him. Outrage headlines about his talk of Mexico sending criminals across the border. It outraged liberals, but did so in a way that reinforced his core message about illegal immigration. His target audience enjoyed the fact that he was provoking the elites, and the high profile they gave him made sure that his messages were well heard. So with gaffe after gaffe, the media were expecting his poll numbers to plummet, and they just kept rising. And he used very visual promises, a big, beautiful wall, not just effective action to tackle a problem. And that worked well for him. Visual imagery is much more powerful than abstract concepts. And of course, it was widely derided and it was widely parodied. But that's the point. It was a compelling visual image, which was exactly the power of it. People parody the things that have an impact on people's consciousness. They don't parody the things that are weak and ineffective. Trump also had a very effective way of destroying his opponents with his distinctive nicknames, which they may have seemed childish and petty, but Jeb Bush never survived becoming low-energy Jeb, and Crooked Hillary tapped right into the checkered history that many people associated with her, made it concrete in people's minds. His campaign message was all about identity and pride. Make America great again. Identity is one of the most powerful motivating forces in politics, compared to Hillary Clinton's slogan, "I'm with her," which was about her, and by implication about the fact that she was a woman, which may have been the point for them, but it had nothing of the power and appeal on a wider basis. It's worth remembering that Barack Obama campaigned on a message of hope. He didn't just say, "Hey look, you could elect me and I'm black." And Trump was unapologetic. He owned his statements, could think on his feet, and only made more headlines when he did so.
You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals. Your Twitter account...
Only Rosie O'Donnell.
He also had some of the things apparently going for him that were more conventional assets for political candidates. People knew that he was a successful businessman. The argument about how successful didn't really matter. His TV reality show persona had been cemented over a decade, and it was pretty unmovable by that point. People assumed he knew how to run things and get things done. And a reputation for competence is a key asset in an election. And they ran an effective campaign behind the scenes, particularly using social media to target Democrat voters to reinforce their dislike of Hillary and persuade them to stay home. Add to that, the times were right for a populist leader, with Brexit and some of the other countries across the world doing similar things. Champions standing against the perceived arrogant elites were tapping into a rich vein of discontent and frustration with how things were going in the world. And this, to some extent, is where my perception of Trump disagrees with Scott Adams' view that Trump is a grandmaster persuader, which you would have to assume would mean that he would be pretty guaranteed to be able to beat the odds and win again in 2020. I think he's more like a Churchill, and I don't mean that in terms of his leadership style or his greatness or anything like that. They are about as different in that way as you could possibly get. But Churchill was generally a bad politician. He was crude, he was divisive, his peacetime judgment was poor. Before the Second World War came along, he had become something of a marginal figure within Parliament. But when the war arrived, he was absolutely the right figure for the moment. It was the situation he was made for, where he could flourish unlike any of his peers. And don't forget, once he won the war, he then lost the next election. People loved him and appreciated what he'd done. They didn't want him as a peacetime Prime Minister. Arguably, Trump's skill set was the same. He would have been ill-suited to be a candidate in many other previous elections, but at a time when waves of political correctness were becoming absorbed into the establishment, when there was a potential for backlash against the idea you shouldn't be proud of your country, then the field was stuffed with unremarkable career politicians or similar. That was the moment when he could uniquely thrive. He excelled as the plucky outsider, tweaking the nose of the establishment. But can he do the same as the incumbent president? The dynamics of an incumbent election are very different. And certainly early this year, it was looking highly likely he was on course to do just that. The economy was doing well, so the more of the same message would have been working perfectly well for him, as it had done for previous presidents in history. He'd made a number of clear mistakes, and lots of people felt he was damaging the image of America in the world. But since the mainstream press and his opponents had spent the latter part of the last election campaign suggesting he was literally Hitler, those criticisms were relatively light. His supporters saw the flaws, figured they didn't really matter that much. The economy was doing well, so he must be getting the basics right. And that's the risk you take when you overreach on the attack against your opponent. The people in the middle begin to discount your judgment. We see it in the UK all the time. Every election, people on the left say, if you elect the Tories, they will abolish the National Health Service. The Tories have won numerous times over the last 3 decades, never abolished the NHS. But they keep saying it every time and wondering why it doesn't work. The mainstream media in the US took it to another level, though, to the degree where they got labelled as suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. And they couldn't help themselves, apparently, but continue to behave in a way that confirmed that perception at every turn. I give you an example from just this week. A CNN and Politico reporter asked the White House press secretary whether Trump believed it was a good thing that the Confederates lost the Civil War. That's what passes for journalism in the age of Trump. So labelling the press as fake news was very effective because time and time again they lived down to the label. It also looked as though he had a fair wind behind him because the Democrats were becoming more and more extreme on the left, certainly in the eyes of the people who voted for Trump, the ones in the centre, not just his loyal base. And if they ended up putting forward one of the more progressive wing as their candidate, and Trump was running on a strong economy, that was a powerful combination that gave Trump the best chance. And then it all changed, as the remarkable year that is 2020 got properly going. Many of his supporters didn't mind that much his failings in leadership because it wasn't that important. Until it became important. With the pandemic, large numbers of Trump supporters have seen those shortcomings and felt, whether rightly or wrongly, that they made things worse. And then with the race riots and the protests, his approach seemed unable to rise to the nature of the moment in the most effective way. And that's the thing. Leadership does actually matter. When you run a press conference to talk about the nationwide pandemic, people want to hear you talking about them and the hard times they're facing. They don't want to hear the president boasting about his ratings. And this is why Scott Adams was wrong about this. A master persuader, as he styled it, would have been the absolute best person to have in that position. He's the one who would have persuaded the country to accept lockdown and do whatever they needed to actually confront the real problem. Wasn't quite what happened. So he's now in trouble. And this week we heard first acknowledgement that Trump himself knows that he's in a hole of his own making. He's no longer the plucky outsider, and his ability to draw attention and put himself at the centre of the story, it's not as appealing to people now. People are just tired of it after 4 years non-stop drama. That air of competence has been eroded with the bits of news that couldn't be dismissed as the biased press, and reinforced by things like the John Bolton book, pillars of the right who had tried to work with him but found his operation all just too dysfunctional to be able to make it work. Add to that the fact that Biden is not Hillary. Nobody's much for Biden, but no one's viscerally against him either. Biden's negative rating was 38% in a survey this month. At this point in 2016, Clinton had a 55% negative rating. And because Trump is currently in a downward spiral moment, they've benefited by stepping back out of the limelight and letting him self-destruct without interruption. Ironically, about a year ago, the shoe was on the other foot when the Dems were fighting amongst themselves with Nancy Pelosi and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the squad totally at war. And at that point, Trump's best approach would have been to do the same. But he couldn't do it. He had to dive in with a controversial intervention that immediately united them against him, which was a tweet he made saying that the squad should go back to the crime-infested countries from whence they came. Self-control with Twitter has clearly never been his biggest asset. His biggest actual asset probably have been his campaign speeches to packed audiences. Well, those have been taken away because of the pandemic. His insistence in going ahead in Tulsa was a double-headed mistake. First, because he ended up with a depleted audience that absolutely gave the opposite impression to what he most wanted and needed. And secondly, because before he did that, he could have pointed to the Democrats supporting Black Lives Matter protests across the country and then pointed to the spike in COVID-19 cases and made a powerful case about their utter irresponsibility. Well, you can't do that when you've held an event like that, and particularly one that was indoors, not outdoors. You can still point to the hypocrisy of those condemning you for doing it when they didn't condemn the people on their own side. It's a valid point, but nowhere near as powerful as it would have been. But then the killer came this week, when he was thrown a softball question by Sean Hannity. Tell us, President Trump, what's the excitement going to be for your second term? Sell it to us. We're ready. And there was nothing. No answer. Not even really coherence. At that point, it really wasn't clear that Trump had any particular reason why he even wanted to be president. And without that, then why would anyone else think that you should be? So that's why people see that he's in deep trouble. A hole so deep he could never dig himself out of it. Yeah, well, not so fast. This is a particular point in time when circumstances have all gone one way for a while. there's still plenty of time and things can and often do change. After all, remember in 2016 how things looked just after the recording of Trump came out, talking about what all the women would let you do to them once you were as famous as he was. That was a pretty deep hole. At that point, he looked pretty much done. And then the FBI made their announcement about Hillary Clinton's email server, and suddenly there was a huge shift. So what would have to happen in the next 4 months for us to see a reversal in the current circumstances? Here's some foreseeable things. There are often unforeseeable ones as well, waiting in the shadows, but we don't know what they are. Right now, Trump is sinking because the Democrats are letting him flounder in public view, getting people to ask the question of themselves, do we want 4 more years of this? Now, obviously, quite a few people do, but it only requires a few less than the last time to shift the balance. But the election isn't really about that question. The election is, do you prefer this known quantity to this other quantity? And it could all go wrong for the Democrats when Biden chooses his vice presidential candidate. The person, remember, who is 1 heartbeat away from the presidency. A lot of people are going to be looking at that person and checking that they're okay with them actually becoming president in the event that Joe Biden's not entirely robust health might give way. Biden's already stated that factors other than competence are primary in creating his shortlist. In other words, he's following the Democrats' preoccupation with identity politics to pre-select on the grounds of gender and probably race as well. And if he decides he should also have a progressive to ensure that the left wing doesn't abandon him like they abandoned Hillary, then you could end up with someone that people wouldn't mind too much as VP, but really wouldn't want as president. And the focus on Biden's health is not going to go away. According to a recent poll, 4 in 10 voters think Joe Biden has dementia. 6 in 10 think he should address it publicly. You know, even if it gets shown that he doesn't technically have dementia, the fact that you're exhibiting characteristics that lead large percentages of people to think that you probably have it, it's not a great sign. And so Biden needs a running mate who would be ahead in the polls if she was the actual candidate. Those people definitely exist. He just has to choose one of them, not one of the others. And when you get head-to-head debates, there's every chance that the contrast will become something that works better for president. You have to assume that he will come back with his second-term programme. And if he can find something compelling for his base, then they'll quickly forget the slow start with the Sean Hannity interview. After all, he doesn't need a new slogan. The old one fits for new circumstances. It just needs a new expression. And when you get to the head-to-head debate, if he can express that powerfully, and if Joe Biden stumbles, then the contrast might well start to work back in his favour. Over the coming months, if the virus recedes again and the economic damage to the country becomes foremost in people's minds, then the question of who can put the economy back together may well become the most important question. Trump is behind Biden on every measure except that one. Trump is still favoured 44% to 38% on the best policies for the economy. The Bill Clinton campaign had the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," and that may well again become the case. And if you add to that the likelihood that protesters will do dumb stuff, and many of the Democrats, even if not actually Joe Biden, will support them. Trump's initial hope that a few riots would, like they supposedly did for Nixon, persuade people that they needed a strong law and order candidate. Well, okay, that wasn't borne out straight away. And that might be because he didn't seem to be effective in rising to that problem. But if it becomes an ongoing and worsening theme, if his opponents become seen as likely to allow it to turn into chaos, then that may start to shift. And it does seem quite possible. The defund the police approach has police forces across the country completely demoralised. Early action in a couple of states may well lead to some predictable negative consequences that will scare a lot of people. It might have to be exceptionally badly handled for those consequences to become compellingly obvious quickly enough for the election. Fair enough. That is entirely possible. In other words, Trump is weakened. And right now, his ability to win re-election depends on his opponents making strategic mistakes, as the Clinton campaign did numerous times in 2016, as well as on himself stopping the flow of his own errors. If Biden comes up with a basically competent platform, manages to choose a vice president seen as sane and competent, and if Trump fails to create a compelling vision for his second term and fails to become more disciplined in campaigning for it, then it's hard to see he's going to be able to perform the magic trick a second time. Don't assume it can't be done. There's a core base of people in America who are still hungry to be made to feel good about themselves and about the country. Post-coronavirus may well be the moment they can be reignited. Right now, Trump has the air of someone who's used up all of his tricks, and what worked well for him doesn't work anymore. Still, 4 months remains a long time in politics, and if you didn't learn not to jump to conclusions in 2016, then you're really not paying attention.